Okay, so this is Unit 5, Part 2. We are talking social psych. We just finished talking about conformity, right? Let's talk a little bit about de-individuation. This is a state of relative anonymity where a person cannot be identified as a particular individual, but only as a group member. So there are conditions in which we feel relatively anonymous, right? Being in a crowd is a good example. Feeling de-individuated. The picture here is the University of Virginia campus, summer 2017. There was a white nationalist demonstration, a march in a Unite the Right protest. It was basically white supremacists, neo-Nazis protesting the removal of the statue of Robert E. Lee. You know, people were marching around chanting anti-Semitic slogans and stuff like that. And they felt empowered to do so, at least in part because they were part of a big group and they incorrectly believed that they would not be personally identified. So being in groups can do it. Anytime you're covering your face, whether it's Ku Klux Klan and their infamous sheets, whether it's Halloween masks, even things like sunglasses can kind of contribute to de-individuation. Because again, there's a feeling of not being recognizable. And what we find is that people can be more aggressive when they're in de-individuated conditions in large groups, when their personal identity is obscured. Back to the Charlottesville white supremacist stuff of summer 2017, you know, things got violent. Part of that may well have been that it's just easier for things to get violent when we are in groups. People can get more aggressive and do things that they would not otherwise do. Research has found that groups who change their appearance before going to war are actually more aggressive against their victims than those that do not change their appearance. So things like war paint, camouflage, are correlated with increased brutality. And of course, there's a long history of war paint for humans in various forms. Let's talk about the Stanford prison study, one of the most notorious studies in all of psychology. You know, the two most notorious studies in psychology are social psych studies. There's this one and there's the Milgram study, which we'll talk about in a bit. So we start with the Stanford prison study. Philip Zimbardo at Stanford University. So he was interested in the power of roles to change people's behaviors, the power of the situation, right, and the roles that we step into. So his intent was to create a fake prison in the basement of the psychology building at Stanford. And so to do that, he needed guards and he needed prisoners. So he advertised for student volunteers. He got 70 student volunteers saying that they wanted to do it. They all got tested for physical fitness, physical health, and mental health. And of the 70 who volunteered, they chose 21 plus a few extras in case, who were scoring as healthy, stable people. They were randomly assigned to either be guards or prisoners in this study. Now, the prisoners were told that the study would begin on a Sunday, and they were not told this part, but it began with a cop pulling up to their door and arresting them in front of their family and their neighbors, right? They were treated much like regular prisoners, handcuffed, driven around for a while, taken to be processed, and then taken to the prison at the basement of the psych building at Stanford. Once they were there, they were ordered to strip. They were sprayed with delousing agent, which was actually just baby powder. They were given uniforms, little hospital gowns that they couldn't wear any clothes underneath, make them feel vulnerable and de-individuated. Caps, stocking caps, to kind of mimic the effect of having their heads shaved. They were given numbers, and from the moment they received their number on, they were referred to by their number and not their name. And they were locked up in these rooms that had iron bars on the windows. The guards got khaki uniforms. They got billy clubs, right? They got sunglasses, mirrored sunglasses, and whistles. So note there, the de-individuation that's happening here with the same uniforms, sunglasses. Now, they were told that their job was to keep the peace in the prison, to run the prison any way they saw fit, and do whatever they needed to do to keep the peace and to keep the prisoners obedient. The only thing they couldn't do was physically, harm them. They couldn't use physical punishment. So, as the study got underway, the guards found that really the only way to keep the prisoners in line and to make them take things seriously was to enforce these pointless, petty rules, punishments like push-ups, midnight wake-ups, solitary confinement. So for example, for solitary, they had a little broom closet that they had access to, and they would put a rowdy prisoner in the broom closet, which was so shallow that the person couldn't even sit on the floor. Their knees would bump into the door. And there was one guy who was in there all day because he wouldn't eat his sausages. So there were these pointless rituals that really are all about reinforcing the fact that the guards have the power and the prisoners are powerless. Right? So all of this was going on. Zimbardo intended to run the study for 2 weeks, but he had to actually shut it down after 6 days because things were getting out of hand. There was this sort of escalation of abuse and the degradation of the prisoners. A couple of prisoners had, nervous breakdowns and had to be relieved. And in fact, he only ended the study because another psychologist came down to see what he was up to. And she said, "It's horrible what you're doing to these boys. It's terrible." And that kind of woke Philip Zimbardo up as to the fact that this was not a good thing. Prior to that, he had been so invested in the study and in the role he had taken in the study of prison superintendent that he didn't really recognize what had been going on as, something that shouldn't be happening. So in the course of those 6 days, about a third of the guards became cruel. They did stuff like deny meals, take away blankets, deny bathroom privileges to control prisoners. They took on, sadistic and domineering and authoritarian roles. It was quite remarkable. And another third were sort of, by the book, not particularly sadistic, but rule followers. And then a final third were kind of nice. They would try to help the prisoners if they could, slip them extra food and stuff. So it was interesting that it panned out that way. Ultimately, the study demonstrated that brutality can be a consequence of a context, a situation that legitimates evil behavior. Right? These were all normal, healthy, regular students. And the ones who, by a flip of the coin, got assigned the role of guard had this high likelihood of showing brutal behavior. Right? Of course, not all of them. So there were probably some individual dispositional factors at play as well. So what does this tell us about the real world? Well, we can talk about Abu Ghraib prison. This was a prison complex in an Iraqi city outside of Baghdad. After years of shared use by US forces and the Iraqi government, the US transferred complete control of the prison to the Iraqis in 2006. It got shut down in 2014. But in the years that the US forces were in control of Abu Ghraib, bad things happened. So the abuses of prisoners at Abu Ghraib by American soldiers in 2004, which was sort of this big scandal that broke, echoed the Stanford prison study. So basically, the guards in there were doing terrible things to the prisoners in there in terms of torture, in terms of psychological as well as physical torture. This is Lindy England we're seeing in a couple of these pictures. She was a former US Army Reserve soldier who was one of 11 personnel convicted in 2005 by Army court-martial in connection with the prisoner abuse at Abu Ghraib. She was sentenced to 3 years in prison. She was dishonorably discharged from the Army. She ended up being released on parole. A lot of people say she was scapegoated because she certainly wasn't the mastermind behind these behaviors, right? Philip Zimbardo was actually called as an expert witness to talk about the importance and the effect of, pathological roles, pathological situations on behavior. Now, some caveats here. Most of the guards during the Iraq War did not engage in abuse. So clearly the situation is not the only variable. And there may have been something quite special going on in that particular cell block at Abu Ghraib. And the other thing to mention is that de-individuation doesn't always mean we're behaving badly. Sometimes it means we're behaving in a good way. What de-individuation specifically means is that it makes us more likely to conform to the norms of the situation. We de-individuate and do what everyone else is doing. If what everyone else is doing is building homes for humanity, right, then that's a good thing. Okay, so it makes us behave like a member of the group more than an individual. All right, sometimes that can mean evil, sometimes not. Okay, let's talk a bit about groupthink. So groupthink is an emphasis on group unanimity, on everybody agreeing, at the expense of critical thinking. Groups can become so intent on ensuring that everybody agrees with everybody else that they lose their capacity to objectively evaluate issues. And as a result, groups can make really terrible decisions because they're not thinking critically about the decisions. They're more concerned with agreeing with everybody else. Okay? So for example, in 1961, there was this failed attempt on the part of the US to invade Cuba via the Bay of Pigs. So after conferring with his cabinet, President Kennedy recruited 1,400 Cuban immigrants to invade Cuba and to overthrow Fidel Castro. It was a catastrophe. Nearly all the invaders were captured or killed. And in hindsight, when you look back at this plan, it was a terrible plan. By any objective measure, it was just not a great plan. So, it's baffling in hindsight as to why these very clever people in Kennedy's cabinet thought it would be a good idea at the time. Right? The plan was very, very bad. So how come that happened? What makes groupthink happen? There are some conditions that make it more likely to occur. This chart is in your textbook. So, for example, an illusion that the group is invulnerable, right? We can't possibly fail. An illusion that the group is unanimous. Obviously, we all agree on this. An unquestioned belief in the moral correctness of the group, right? We're the good guys. Conformity pressure, pressure on group members to go along with everybody else. So having this kind of sense that if you did protest, it wouldn't be welcomed. Stereotyping of the outgroup. So, the enemy will never figure out this stuff. They're all morons. They're all idiots. Self-censorship, the tendency of group members to keep their mouths shut even when they have doubts, right? So thinking in your head, if you're a member of this group, I suspect this is a bad idea, but I better not say anything. And mind guards, these are self-appointed individuals who decide it's their job to stifle disagreement. So they'll say stuff to naysayers like, oh, you think you know better than us? You don't like this plan? Well, what's your plan? You got anything better? Right? So they kind of punish people who are raising questions. So groupthink is a very, very bad dynamic, and good group leaders try to set groups up so that doesn't happen, right? You can minimize groupthink by encouraging dissent. So the leader can explicitly say, I want you guys to try to identify weaknesses in the plan. You can do that by appointing a devil's advocate, right? Where it's somebody's explicit job to kind of be the naysayer. You can have an independent expert evaluate the decision, right? So after the group comes to a decision, pass it off to someone who wasn't part of the process and get their opinion. You can hold follow-up meetings, something as simple as convening again a few days later and saying, has anybody had any thoughts since we last met, that we need to think about. So that's groupthink. Then there's group polarization. So group polarization happens when group discussion strengthens a dominant position held by the individual group members. It can make individual positions more extreme. So let's take an example here. Let's say you go to a movie with your friends, and while you're sitting there in the theater watching it, you're thinking to yourself, it's not terrific, it's not going to win any Oscars, but it's not awful. It's kind of right? Afterwards, you go out for a bite to eat with your buddies. People start talking about all the ways the movie wasn't an Oscar winner. And before long, group position shifts from it wasn't terrible, but it wasn't great, to it was really awful. Right? So the dominant position, which was slightly negative, moved as a result of group discussion towards extremely negative. Okay? People can take more extreme views after group discussion. So the average opinion starts out mildly negative. After discussion, it becomes more strongly negative. It can also work in the positive direction, right? Where you come out thinking it's pretty good, and then as a result of discussion, you think it's terrific. So this is important. Polarization is important for understanding the world we're living in today. The electorate in the US has become strongly polarized, right? We've got left-leaning citizens becoming more liberal, right-leaning citizens becoming more conservative than previous generations. And it's like two tribes going to war with very little common ground. And some of this is probably due to the accessibility of the internet, all the blogs on the internet, all the radio talk show hosts, the 24-hour news cycles now, which provide this steady diet of cherry-picked information that supports the beliefs of the viewers and fuels confirmation bias, right? If you're looking at your Facebook feed, Facebook has an algorithm that places stuff on your feed that's consistent with what you already like, what you put the thumbs up for. So you're really living in like an echo chamber that's just confirming your own biases in Facebook. Or if you're watching, biased news shows like Fox News, for example, which just, spins every story so that it's consistent with a particular worldview. Very few people on either end of the political spectrum, explore the other viewpoint. We're not really talking to each other anymore. We're not exposing ourselves to information that challenges our view, and that's a problem. That generates and maintains this polarization. All right, this is interesting stuff, cults. So in extreme forms, groupthink can lead to cults. These are groups that exhibit intense, unquestioning devotion to some single cause. Most cults aren't dangerous, but some can be quite dangerous and disastrous. So we're going to look at some of the more extreme cults here. First one to mention is Heaven's Gate, which was a California group founded in 1975 by this guy, Marshall Applewhite. If you go to YouTube and look for him, you'll see that there's quite a few videos where he's expressing the viewpoints of his cult, the Heaven's Gate. He and his followers believed that he was a reincarnated version of Jesus, and that his job ultimately was to take his followers to a starship that would take them to their afterlife. So the Heaven's Gate cult all wore the same clothes. They had these patches on their clothes. They all lived together on in a compound in San Diego. And for years, they were quiet and peaceful and nothing bad happened. And then in 1997, the Hale-Bopp comet approached the Earth, which was a rare occurrence, and it made the news. And there were some false reports circulating in the media that a spaceship was spotted, in the tail of the comet. And the Heaven's Gate members believed that this was their cue. This was the spaceship coming to take them away to the afterlife. So at Marshall Applewhite's behest, all 39 members committed suicide on the same day by drinking this poison cocktail and then lying down in their bunk beds and dying. Dressed, by the way, ready to travel. So cults promote groupthink in 4 big ways. The first is that they have a persuasive leader who fosters loyalty. So for example, David Koresh of the Branch Davidians was this charismatic leader. Charles Manson of the Manson family, charismatic leader. Marshall Applewhite of the Heaven's Gate, Jim Jones of the People's Temple. So step one is have a charismatic, persuasive leader that people will follow. Step two, the leader disconnects members from the outside world in a few different ways and limits their exposure to dissenting views. So the Branch Davidians with David Koresh all lived in a compound in Waco, Texas. They were hoarding weaponry. They were raided in 1993 by the FBI for possession of illegal firearms. And it became a firestorm. 75 people were killed in the raid, including children. The Heaven's Gate cult in San Diego, 39 people committed suicide in 1997. This is footage of them taking the bodies out. People's Temple compound in Jonestown, Guyana. Jim Jones bought land in Guyana and brought his hundreds of followers to live there, and then had them all commit mass suicide in 1978. Those are bodies you're seeing there. It was suicide and or murder. There's some evidence that some of the people didn't want to drink the poison Kool-Aid. They were in great big drums, and that perhaps had been forced to do so. That's where the term, they drank the Kool-Aid comes from, if you've ever heard that term, don't drink the Kool-Aid. Okay, so you've got a charismatic leader who disconnects the followers from the rest of the world. They live together in compounds, right? They discourage questioning assumptions within the group. So they create a culture within the cult where you simply don't question the teachings and the leaders. And the process of indoctrinating members is a gradual one. People don't just wake up one day and say, I'd like to join a cult. There is a slow process, a foot in the door kind of process where, maybe someone knocks on your door one day and they're from some religious sect that's set up shop down the road, and they give you a pamphlet. If you take their pamphlet, maybe they'll be back a few days later with an invitation to go to their open house on the weekend. And if you go to the open house, then maybe you'll get to go to be invited to the picnic at the end of the month. And maybe a weekend retreat after that. And so on and so on. So it's a slow step-by-step kind of indoctrination. It's not usually the case that the members of the cult are themselves psychologically or emotionally disturbed, although the leaders usually are. The leaders usually have psychological issues. As for this term brainwashing, we really don't need to raise the specter of brainwashing here. There's no evidence for special strategies to indoctrinate the cult members. We understand how that happens without having to, invoke this term. It's a step-by-step indoctrination. Now, to kind of help people not get suckered into cults, there's something called the inoculation effect, which is where you teach people about a particular cult and their beliefs, right? You sort of expose the public to what the cult stands for, and then also debunk those beliefs so that the public has some tools for critically evaluating the ideas. So I've got a poster here of a documentary, Going Clear, Scientology in the Prison of Belief, which was like a winner at the Sundance Film Festival back in 2015, exposing the tenets of Scientology to the general public, and thereby hopefully inoculating a lot of the general public from getting sucked into the cult's beliefs. Okay, probably a good place to pause now and pick this up in section part 3. So I'm going to stop recording and see you in the next segment.